Chapter 8 of Space Tug by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Space Tug, Chapter 8. All the sensations were familiar. The small fleet of improbable objects rose and rose. Of all flying objects ever imagined by man, the launching cages supported by pushpots were most irrational. The squadron, though, was bumbling upward. In the manned ship, Joe was more tense than on his other takeoff, if such a thing was possible. His work was harder this trip. Before, he'd had Mike at communications and the chief at the steering rockets, while Haney kept the pushpots balanced for thrust. Now Joe flew the manned ship alone. Headphones and a mic gave him communications with the shed direct, and the pushpots were balanced in groups, which cost efficiency but helped on control. He would have, moreover, to handle his own steering rockets during acceleration, and when he could, and dared, he should supervise the others. Because each of the other three had two drone ships to guide. True, they had only to keep their drones in formation, but Joe had to navigate for all. The four of them had been assigned this flight because of its importance. They happened to be the only crew alive who had ever flown a spaceship designed for maneuvering, and their experience consisted of a single trip. The jet stream was higher this time than on the other journey, now 2 months past. They blundered into it at 36,000 feet. Joe's headphones buzzed tinnily. Radar from the ground told him his rate of rise, his ground speed, his orbital speed, and added comments on the handling of the drones. The last was not a precision job. On the way up, Joe protested, "Somebody's ship, number 4, is lagging. Snap it up." Mike said crisply, "Got it, Joe. Coming up." "The shed says 3 separate ships are getting out of formation, and we need due east pointing. Check it." The chief muttered, "Something wacky here. Come round, you." "Okay, Joe." Joe had no time for reflection. He was in charge of the clumsiest operation ever designed for an exact result. The squadron went wallowing toward the sky. The noise was horrible. A tinny voice in his headphones. "You are at 65,000 feet. Your rate of climb curve is flattening. You should fire your JADOs when practical. You have some leeway in rocket power." Joe spoke into the extraordinary maze of noise waves and pressure systems in the air of the cabin. "We should blast. I'm throwing in the series circuit for JADOs. Try to line up. We want the drones above us and with a spread, remember? Go to it." He watched his direction indicator and the small graphic indicators telling of the drones. The sky outside the ports was dark purple. The launching cage responded sluggishly. Its open end came around toward the east. It wobbled and wavered. It touched the due east point. Joe stabbed the firing button. Nothing happened. He hadn't expected it. The 7 ships had to keep in formation. They had to start off on one course, with a slight spread as a safety measure, and at one time. So the firing circuits were keyed to relays in series. Only when all 7 firing keys were down at the same time would any of the JADOs fire. Then all would blast together. The pilots in the cockpit bubbles of the pushpots had an extraordinary view of the scene. At something over 12 miles height, 7 aggregations of clumsy black things clung to frameworks of steel, pushing valorously. Far below there were clouds and there was earth. There was a horizon which wavered and tilted. The pushpots struggled with seeming lack of purpose. One of the 7 seemed to drop below the others. They pointed vaguely this way and that, all of them, but gradually they seemed to arrive at an uncertain unanimity. Joe pushed the firing button again as his own ship touched the due east mark. Again nothing happened. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Haney pressing down both buttons. The chief's finger lifted. Mike pushed down one button and held off the other. Roarings and howlings of push-pots. Wobblings and heart-breaking clumsinesses of the drone ships. They hung in the sky while the push-pots used up their fuel. "We've got to make it soon," said Joe grimly. "We've got 40 seconds, or we'll have to go down and try again." There was a clock dial with a red sweep hand which moved steadily and ominously toward a deadline time for firing. Up to that deadline, the push-pots could let the ships back down to Earth without crashing them. After it, they'd run out of fuel before a landing could be made. The deadline came closer and closer. Joe snapped, "Take a degree leeway. We've got 10 seconds." He had the manned ship nearly steady. He held down the firing button, holding aim by infinitesimal movements of the controls. Haney pushed both hands down, raised one, pushed again. The chief had one finger down. Mike had both firing buttons depressed. The chief pushed down his second button quietly. There was a monstrous impact. Every JATO in every pushpot, about every launching cage, fired at once. Joe felt himself flung back into his acceleration chair. 6 gravities. He began the horrible fight to stay alive, while the blood tried to drain from the conscious forepart of his brain, and while every button of his garments pressed noticeably against him, and objects in his pockets pushed. The sides of his mouth dragged back, and his cheeks sagged, and his tongue strove to sink back into his throat and strangle him. It was very bad. It seemed to last for centuries. Then the JATOs burned out. There was that ghastly feeling of lunging forward to weightlessness. One instant, Joe's body weighed half a ton. The next instant, it weighed less than a dust grain. His head throbbed twice, as if his skull were about to split open and let his brains run out. But these things he had experienced before. There were pantings in the cabin about him. The ship fell. It happened to be going up, but the sensation and the fact was free fall. Joe had been through this before, too. He gasped for breath and croaked, "Drones?"
"Right,"
said Haney. Mike panted anxiously.
"4's off course. I'll fix it."
The chief grunted guttural Mohawk. His hand stirred on the panel for remote control of the drones he had to handle.
"Crazy,"
he growled.
"Got it now, Joe. Fire when ready."
"Okay, Mike?" A half-second pause.
"Okay."
He pressed the firing button for the takeoff rockets, and he was slammed back into his acceleration chair again. But this was 3 gravities only. Pressed heavily against the acceleration cushions, he could perform the navigation for the fleet. He did. The mothership had to steer a true course, regardless of the vagaries of its rockets. The drones had simply to be kept in formation with it. The second task was simpler, but Joe was relieved this time of the need to report back instrument readings. A telemetering device took care of that. The takeoff rockets blasted and blasted and blasted. The mere matter of staying alive grew very tedious. The ordeal seemed to last for centuries. Actually, it could be measured only in minutes, but it seemed millennia before the headphone said, staccato fashion,
"You are on course, and will reach a speed in 14 seconds. I will count for you."
"Relays for rocket release," panted Joe. "Throw 'em over." 3 hands moved to obey. Joe could release the drive rockets on all 7 ships at will. The voice counted,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cut.
Joe pressed the master key. The remnants of the solid fuel takeoff rockets let go. They flashed off into nothingness at unbelievable speed, consuming themselves as they went. There was again no wait. This time there was no resting, no eager gazing out the cabin ports. Now they weren't curious. They had over a month in space, and something like 16 days back on Earth.